November, hooey. I can't quite believe it's November and we've got one more meeting until the long summer break. And then our February face-to-face hooey, the big one. I'll tell you a bit more about that later. For today though, we are here to look at a summary of what we have thought about in terms of mitigation of climate change and adaptation to climate change impacts. So we're going to be hearing quite a lot from different people today. Firstly, we're going to think about the timeline that we're looking at in terms of mitigation, so the need to reduce our emissions, and the timeline for some of the impacts of climate change we're going to have to adapt to. So we're going to be hearing from several people who have a different perspective on that. That's going to take a bit longer than our normal presentations do, but there'll be time for some questions at the end. So as we go through, if you would like to pop your questions into the chat, then at the end of the presentations, I will facilitate those questions being put to the speakers. So if you would like to direct your question to a particular speaker, then put that in the chat at the same time, please. In terms of recording today, I've thought that perhaps a more useful way of recording our hooeys is to just record the presentations. That might make them more shareable, more useful, more interesting to people outside the forum, be more of a resource than recording an hour and a half of conversation. So with your permission, that's what I'll do. Having heard from those presentations and had our Q&A and come to a shared understanding of the kind of timelines we're looking at and what that means for urgency of action, then we'll hear from the group that's been working on producing or synthesizing our regional strategic climate action plan that we've been producing as a forum over the last several months. I'm really excited to see this come to fruition. We're in a draft stage, but it's a really great stage to be in, and I'm really stoked that we're here before the summer break. So with nothing else from me, I will hand over to the first of our speakers. Oh, actually, there is one more thing, which is to let you know that after the presentation on the Climate Action Plan, we'll have a breakout room discussion, and you'll have a choice of topics to talk about within that discussion on the Climate Action Plan. The topics will be mitigation in terms of reducing emissions, mitigation in terms of increasing sequestration of carbon, adaptation in terms of physical changes to our climate and what that means for us and other species, and adaptation in terms of social and economic impacts. So there's quite a lot of choices there. Oh, and a fifth one of the vision and values and how that fits in with our strategic action plan. So hopefully that will work out with the group that's been working on this document, and they can let me know in the chat or in a private message which one they intend to be assigned to. And hopefully there'll be one person from each group who's keen to facilitate that discussion. They don't have to be experts in that topic, but willing to hold that space. That'd be really cool. Okay, so over to our presenters. We have today Chris Cameron from Nelson City Council, our climate champion. Thanks, Chris, for being here. He's going to be talking to us twice today. We also have Jack Santa Barbara, who's going to be talking a little bit on energy descent and a timeline for that. And Sue Robb, also from Nelson City Council, who's going to be talking to us about the projections for flooding and inundation in Nelson over time because of sea level rise. So starting off with Chris. Kia ora, Chris.
Good morning, everyone. Hello. A little bit of echo going on by the sounds of things.
Yeah, I can hear you just fine, thanks.
Okay, good. Look, I'll just go and share my screen. So let me just work out how to do that. Look, first I should also say that we do have, Sue is not available today, unfortunately, so I can cover off some of the things that Sue was going to talk about. But part of the reason she's not available was that the mapping for coastal inundation was meant to have come out yesterday, and that's been delayed to today. So it's actually been released this afternoon. I think 1 p.m. is the time that we'll see that. So I can talk a little bit about that on her behalf. But also, I haven't actually prepared 2 separate presentations, but I can stop, and I know, I think Jack's got a session to present, so I can stop and at the appropriate point and let Jack do that if you like. Either that, or I could run right through and do the whole thing, whatever you prefer.
If we can split them to fit energy descent in with mitigation, that would make more sense, I think.
Cool. Okay.
Thanks.
All right. So I'll get started. I'll just get this PowerPoint up and running. So just bear with me. Okay. Right. So look, I'm just going to explore a number of climate change matters from both a council perspective and my own perspective, and I guess provide some updates on things that I've been working on and things that I've been aware of over the last little while. So getting straight into it then. Change is coming, and we all know this, and I guess that's why you have all become involved in the Climate Forum and are enthusiastic to participate in it. And you know, the point is that things are accelerating, and I guess sea level rise is one of the key aspects of that, and temperature rise and other aspects of climate change that we're seeing happen. So for me, you know, we're starting to see these changes in the form of the droughts, the fires, the storms, the coastal inundation, and those things are predicted to accelerate. So there is a different world coming, and to me, the key aspect or the key word in terms of climate change is actually the change part of it. So how do we shift ourselves to be more change ready? And to what extent are we resistant to change, both as individuals and organisations? That's something that you know, from a council perspective is challenging, and it's something that we need to be grappling with across our organisation, but it also cuts across many others, as I said. So those who are change ready, it seems to me, will be most best placed to actually be able to cope as climate impacts begin to hit. So in terms of climate adaptation, certainly sea level rise should be one of the highest priority topics of focus for any coastal community, and in fact for non-coastal communities as well, because they will be likely to experience the financial and other impacts as well of climate change responses. So just turning to questions of reducing our emissions, and some of this is not new to people. I'm sure you'll be well aware in terms of everyone needs to play their part. So I'm not going to go into this too much. And I think that certainly what would be good to see, and I think what we are starting to see, is some improved action from government with the agreement to the Zero Carbon Act, and the fact that we now have government targets and are soon to have 5-year emissions budgets released, means that we're going to be much better placed, and we are expecting to see some central government policy coming out, an emissions reduction plan from government. So actually just sticking on that point for a moment, I've had some discussions with people from the Ministry for the Environment in the last few weeks. And seeking an update really in terms of what some of those policies might look like for emissions reduction. There is a cross-government effort going on to address this and to find where the actions are going to happen that will allow us as a country to meet our emissions targets and to stay on track with the budgets. So some examples of those include expanding some existing work that's happening in the waste sector. And waste sectors, obviously, it's already part of the emissions trading scheme. and the price of carbon within the emissions trading scheme will be one of the elements that encourages that action to happen. But also there's been movement in the space of waste levy and other things. The government's also looking to beef up the emissions trading scheme in the area of industrial emissions. So I know that's a big concern to some ministers, industrial emissions and heat and power that come from fossil fuels and so on. And there's been some recent discussion about that with the likes of Fonterra and others that people might have seen in the media. And then there's an element of what we do with vehicle fleets, and there's a whole lot of work going on there. I think we'll expect to see some of the concepts that were attempted to be pushed through during the last term of government actually come back to the fore again and get some traction this time around. And a final point is around some greater expectations for corporate organisations in terms of their risk reporting for climate change. So this is mainly around climate impacts, but also to some extent around emissions. What's the exposure of an organisation to risk if the price of carbon doubles, or if what's its exposure to risk if it operates in an area that's going to become more exposed to physical risk from sea level rise, for example, over time. So as far as the question of the, oh sorry, there are a couple more actually on my list of government ones. I'll just stick back to that for a second. So the Building for Climate Change program, which has been run by MB, is about the construction industry, and targeting both embodied and operational emissions within that industry. So that's something that the government's looking to pursue. The He Waka Eke Noa, the Primary Sector Emissions Reduction Initiative, there's a lot of work going on in that space, and there's a lot of research going on obviously in the space of agriculture as well. And the 1 billion trees program is continuing to move forward. Yeah, so I mentioned about some of the vehicle standards. So the idea of clean car standards is also concepts for improved government direction on renewable energy. And certainly that's been signalled also in the past by government around reaching a 100% renewable target. So coming to council. For council, we're already doing a whole lot of stuff on climate change, and including funding the climate forum. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here. If people have questions, I'm happy to cover things off. We're currently in the process of developing our own emissions reduction action plan for council emissions. And that's in line with the fact that we've taken on the government's targets, and we'll take on the government budgets once they're released and finalised. And there's a whole bunch of activities that sit within that emissions reduction plan for council's own activities. So please, yeah, ask questions if you have further questions on where we're going as a council. So finally on this one, I had the question of urgency. So, you know, again, it's obvious that the longer we leave it in terms of reducing our emissions, the worse the impacts will be. So it ties directly into climate impacts and adaptation. The urgency comes about because we've been slow to respond, and that's both, you know, nationally and internationally. Means we have to move much more quickly now than we would have. I think there's a sense in some quarters that, you know, technology will come along to suck carbon out of the air, and some of that is developing. But I don't think we can necessarily rely on that to save us from the worst impacts. And so for me, a lot of it, again, in terms of the urgency of the situation, comes back to the question of government and international leadership to take us along the path that we need to take. And, you know, I think now is probably the best opportunity that we've ever had to see those things happen. So look, that was my emissions and mitigation section. Happy to hand over to Jack to cover off his bit.
Kia ora. Thanks, Chris. That was a useful background in what's needed and by whom. Over to you, Jack and Joe. Oh, we can't hear you. You're muted still.
Okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Thanks.
And can you see my screen?
No.
No.
If you click share screen at the bottom.
Oh, there we go. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So, kia ora, climate colleagues. I'm going to be talking about energy descent as a risk factor and emphasize the fact that it's a hidden risk factor. That is one that's not generally being considered and talked about, and why it's important. This isn't an issue that is generally discussed by decision makers, but there's a number of research teams around the world that have been looking at energy issues and the energy descent issue. And they're making pleas to incorporate these sort of analyses into the International Energy Agency and the IPCC reports, where we know we have to make reductions of about 8% in emissions per year. And how we're going to do this as we make a transition to renewables and what the implications of that are. So there, as I say, there's many research groups that are calling attention for scientists, policymakers, world leaders, as well as us and the public to understand the energetic limits that there are to economic growth. This is really about an inflection point in history. The last century and a half, all of the time that all of us have been alive, we've only experienced increases in total energy availability. That's about to change, and it's going to have some very dramatic impacts. So one emphasized that energy descent is a physical reality, and it simply means that we're going to have less energy available over the next few decades. And this is a risk factor because we need energy for our well-being. It's intimately related to our well-being. So it's hidden because decision makers tend to focus on total energy availability. And that's been growing over the last several decades. But net energy has been declining, and that net energy analysis is generally ignored for good reasons, and we won't go into that. But the fact that it's being ignored has some serious implications for us. Net energy is like net pay. It's what you actually get to use rather than just producing more energy. And as I mentioned, it's been declining for several decades. This is because oil, the net energy from oil and natural gas has been declining. The net energy peak occurred several decades ago. And we haven't realized or really felt it because the total energies continue to increase. But what's happening now is that coal is projected to have its net energy start declining, and very soon. And when that happens, we're really going to feel it in ways that we haven't before. And this is going to have dramatic impacts on all of society. The projections by various research groups is that by 2050, we're going to have 20 to 30% less energy available with a transition to a mostly renewable energy system. And that's because largely renewables have a lower net energy return than fossil fuels. And the limitations, while there's many advantages to renewables, this energetic limitation is generally not well understood. And it's important that we incorporate it into our planning, because it's going to impact our economy, our society, and our politics, and quite soon. But even though it's a significant risk factor, there is going to be sufficient energy available for well-being if we do it right. But we have to plan for this. We have to understand it and plan for it. And collectively, we're really not doing that, not just in New Zealand, but globally. And this is the big risk factor. And so here's just some highlights about how to think about energy descent as you're thinking about the area of your involvement with the climate issues, in terms whether it's mitigation or adaptation. Think about how to do things that need doing with less energy. Conservation, reduction has got to be number one. It's inevitable we're going to be dealing with less. If we plan for that, we'll be ahead of the game. The next important issue is to consider net energy analyses, not just look at the total energy produced, but the net that's going to be available when we make decisions and investments about our energy systems. And finally, we have to balance the whole issue of finances and profits with the well-being impact of our energy use, and ensure that it's going to be available for everyone so that we do not have energy poverty experienced by members of our community. Now, this has been a very quick overview. There's lots of in-depth material on the Climate Forum website under the Resources tab called Energy Descent Material. I encourage you to go there. And if any groups would like support and assistance in thinking about energy descent in their particular groups, I'd be delighted to assist. Just get in touch with me. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've heard a bit about who needs to be doing what in terms of emission reduction, about energy descent and how that fits in with this transition to renewable energy. Joe, I wonder if you could put in a few words about what we know about the timeline for that transition.
Okay. What I'll start with is the United Nations Environmental Program calculations on a global basis, where they say to have even a reasonable chance of staying below 1.5 degrees increased temperature, we need to be reducing, and I'll give their figures here and then comment on it. We need to be reducing emissions at 7.6% per annum, starting with 2017 levels. That when you look at it, is a shocking amount, and we need to absorb that shock into our planning. We also need to do a little recalculation, which the STAR group member David Ayres has done, to make take into account the fact that we didn't start in 2019 when the United Nations Environmental Programme said this. We're starting a little late, so that the percentage accordingly goes up to something under 8%, but many people are using the 8% figure now. We need to be reducing at 8% a year to aim at roughly halfway by 2030 and net zero at 2050. Now, these data will be modified when the Climate Change Commission delivers its first, second and third 5-year budgets in May next year. And I note with interest that James Shaw has just said, we'll be shocked when we get that first budget. Well, members of this forum probably won't be shocked, because we're starting to take this in now, and this is reflected in our regional climate action plan material, but we'll be needing to respond to other people's shock. when people realize just how fast we have to both reduce and sequester.
Thank you. That was really helpful context to put that into. And what you're talking about with reducing emissions to net zero, just for clarity, that's about our amount of carbon, etc., that we emit, minus the amount that we manage to sequester. So that's why we've got the 2 breakout rooms today on mitigation, one on how we reduce our emissions and one on how we increase that sequestration or drawdown of carbon. Thank you. Okay, back over to Chris on his thoughts on adaptation and what a timeline for that might look like.
Thanks, Judy. I'll just share this screen again. So, yeah, look, I guess there's a number of components of adapting to climate change that we need to think about, and it's something I've been putting thought into for a long time. And I guess one of the main things is, where are we at risk and what are our vulnerabilities? And the release of the maps showing coastal inundation today is one part of that. It's identifying where risks exist from sea level rise of up to 2 meters. But within that, there's a whole range of questions around what's at stake, what is likely to be affected in those areas that are at risk, what's vulnerable. And not just in dollar terms, but also in terms of across the 4 well-beings. And there's, I think, increasing interest in pieces of work that can identify what those values are, and certainly through the consultation process, through the feedback that we're seeking on the coastal hazard mapping, is for people to say what is it that they value, not just in terms of their house or economic value, but in terms of other parts of the city that would be affected or will be affected by that sea level rise, and how they'd like to have those things recognised. So I guess there's a question then of what it is that we value. What do people value in those areas that are likely to be affected, whether that's from an environmental perspective, whether that's from an infrastructure perspective, private property, whether it's from a cultural perspective. There may be some key important areas that are culturally important that may be exposed as well. So I guess values are a really interesting thing in terms of across those 4 well-beings. From a council point of view, usually economic development is a high priority in maintaining a ratepayer base. But there's a lot more of concern to the wider population and us as individuals. And so the question of values for me also ties into something around what principles might we have in how we respond and adapt to climate change. And I drafted a few principles that I thought could be appropriate. One was adapting to change, including through transformation, is key to New Zealand's wellbeing. A second one could be involving all communities of interest in decision making will be critical to successful adaptation. And a third one I had was sharing both costs and decision making equitably across the community will ensure the best outcomes for climate adaptation. So, I mean, those are just kind of starting points for us to be thinking about what is it that we'd see as being the ways in which we seek to have outcomes that work for everyone across the community. So then looking a little bit at response options. So I guess, the first point with responses is that we really need to assess a whole range of different options for responding to climate change, and particularly to sea level rise. We often hear about that the costs of responding are going to be huge, but we don't actually know how big they are and how they compare between different response options. How does building a seawall, for example, compare with a managed retreat approach? And how can we compare apples with apples when we're looking at those 2 different responses? And also how do those costs look and how do they change if we are increasingly not being covered by insurance? Particularly in high risk areas, there's a likelihood that insurance will withdraw, and therefore those costs will need to fall somewhere else. We haven't got an unlimited pot of money. We need to spend it wisely. And in fact, someone said the other day, I can't recall when it was, but that we need to manage both our costs and our carbon as if we've got a bucket that we're emptying, and that's really important here. So if costs fall back on both ratepayers and taxpayers, then how does that pan out, and how does that balance occur across the nation? In fact, when we're saying, look, taxpayers have been asked to put the bill for something that's happening in Nelson, how does that stack up against something that's happening in another part of the country? So it's a question partly around what's actually feasible in terms of responding to climate change and what's affordable from that cost perspective. And there's also some questions there around, you know, the costs and benefits. Who gets benefits? If you live in a coastal area and it's agreed that a sea wall will be built to protect that area, then it's those residents who are most likely to get the most benefit from that. Others might get some benefit, but maybe not to the same extent. So that's part of the discussion. And I think a lot of this is coming out through the proposed reforms to the RMA. And you know, as well, in terms of growing costs of the impacts of climate change, the taxes and rates might need to increase to cover those costs, and development in at-risk areas would need to be more closely scrutinised potentially. So you know, from a council perspective, under the current sort of competitive model that we have, councils can really struggle with the idea of businesses picking up sticks and going elsewhere, resulting in a loss of rates revenue. So then move on to the question of timeframes. That actually, the way I look at it is in terms of the short time frame, what is starting to be impacted or will be soon impacted by climate change. And then the long term, what is it that we want to look like strategically and respond over a multi-decades time period? So the short-term viewpoint is, you know, with our existing properties, with our existing assets, our infrastructure, our important cultural, social, and environmental areas, how can we protect, or how can we ensure that those areas are able to continue to operate as we would expect them to? And so from a council perspective, in terms of our assets and infrastructure, we have a strong focus on maintaining a level of service that we deliver to the community. And it's one of the things that we need to look at with climate change is how we may need to lower the expectations around maintaining levels of service over time with some of those activities, and in particular at high risk locations. And that becomes a discussion around, okay, if we're continuing to invest in high risk locations, should we instead focus our investments elsewhere where there's a lower risk? And to reflect the fact that some of those activities may not be able to deliver on their full lifespan that might have been expected from them. So then looking at that long-term viewpoint, and it's interesting to think of, you know, climate change has been described as a slow motion, or sea level rise in particular, a slow motion tsunami. So then thinking about, okay, so how would we respond if we knew that a tsunami was going to hit? You'd evacuate people from at-risk areas, you'd move as much property out of harm's way as you could, and you'd aim to minimize the damage. So, you know, I think all of those things probably still apply in terms of our response to the long-term change. So there's a question of urgency. I had this for the mitigation perspective as well, but this time for adaptation, you know, infrastructure is a really big part of how a city adapts to climate change. that's whether you're talking about a protection approach or whether you're talking about a managed retreat approach. That's because you need to be thinking about how you maintain those networks and systems that people rely on for water and for wastewater and for waste and so on, for power, for telecoms, for transport routes, all of those things. If they need to be rethought and relocated, that takes time. So we need to start now. We need to think about the steps that are needed to get us to delivering, finally, some years down the track, what it is we want. And I often refer to the example of Transmission Gully, which has been over 40 years now in the development, and it's not quite yet finished. There's an interesting factor that's come into Transmission Gully is that they have, one of the things that slowed it down is that they've run out of gravel material to do the building. So there wasn't enough forethought put into the fact that quarries in the Wellington region were going to run out of gravel, and there's demand from not only the Transmission Gully build, but from other projects in the region. And that's exactly the sort of problem we need to be avoiding when we go forward with preparing for climate change. So the last point I had here was about planning approaches. And I guess one of the things that can be concerning is that if you identify hazard zones, that can suggest that you're safe if you're on one side of the line and unsafe if you're on the other side of the line. And I think with climate change, we need to be a bit smarter than that. We need to do adaptive planning and be ready to shift that line over time and not be stuck in having an increased amount of development and activity behind that line. So I hope that part of what we'll see through the reform of the RMA, we'll see that Climate Adaptation and Managed Retreat Act that's been talked about, we'll be considering those sorts of things. So this next bit goes on to the coastal hazards engagement and what's happening there. So Julie, do you want me to cover that now or to, yeah, okay, I'll carry on. So what we're doing is the coastal hazards engagement, it's the maps that I talked about for sea level rise up to 2 meters. The material has been released this afternoon. The Nelson plan in itself, is a separate thing, but the coastal hazard mapping has been done alongside the Nelson plan, if you like, and we're seeking some feedback on it. So this is early conversations. We have had some discussions in the community last year, and I think mostly with coastal communities and their sense of what the issues might be in their suburbs. So what we've been doing here is following the Ministry for the Environment's good practice guidance for coastal management, as well as keeping an eye on what's happening in other parts of the country and the way that they're approaching it. So it identifies, as I said, up to 2 meters of sea level rise, and there's an online tool which I'll provide the link for shortly, where you can go and look at an address or look at a part of the city and see how it may be affected. So this is the start, I guess, of a long and ongoing process where we're looking to continue discussions with the community and to continue to work through what the issues are, what the values are, and how we might choose to respond to them. So what we'd like to do is both provide the public with increased information and better understanding of what sort of issues we might face, but also get their feedback about what they value, what you value, and how we might account for that in what we're doing. So that's the values part of it. So in terms of the engagement, we've got engagement starting from now. There has already been some engagement sessions on the Nelson plan component. Engagement starting from next week in terms of drop-in sessions with the coastal inundation mapping. As I said, they'll be available online. And also today, on release of the maps, is the notifications are going out on people's limbs. So that's affecting a large number of homes in Nelson, over 4,000, I believe. So a lot of people will have an interest in this. So here's the detail on the sessions, the drop-in sessions that are coming up. 2 next week, Tuesday and Thursday, and different parts of Nelson, so people can get there from their local community. So feel free to share that information or come along to any of those sessions. And the website's there for Shape Nelson, which is the platform that we use for gathering some of the sort of online feedback from people, or come along to the session and you can provide that in person. So I guess for that part, yeah, really encourage you to take a look at those maps, come along to the drop-in sessions, submit your thoughts. In talking with Sue Robb, who was going to come along, she's happy to present to this group in a couple of weeks' time once the maps have been out for a while, or a subgroup of the Climate Forum, if people were interested in doing that and seeing some more of that feedback from the people that have been putting that together. So look, I think the final thing I had here was around collaboration and engagement, and I think this is key for both climate adaptation and mitigation. But really, this point that we can't do it alone. No one organisation or no individual can solve this alone. We must work together, and that's, you know, obviously that's a key purpose and goal of the Climate Forum. So very, very important that we do that, and certainly with the ongoing discussions around sea level rise and climate impacts for Nelson, I'd like to maintain that conversation that's starting, as I say, with the release of these maps today, and continues with a structured dialogue, facilitated processes, and gathering information from different parts of the community so that we can actually look to establish what our responses might look like for climate adaptation in particular. That's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. That was really useful information. I'm just going to pop a link in the chat to some more information on timelines of adaptation. It's a very accessible series of short videos and related information from the spin-off, who have done a 100-year forecast. So the chat's, the link is in the chat there, and I'll just share my screen with you of a couple of little pieces to give you an idea of what you'll find if you go there and have a look. So here is a difference in rainfall through the seasons. So we can see Nelson there getting more wet, and there's our autumn and summer and spring. So they're thinking about rainfall. They also think about temperature, which you can see there, changing under different emissions scenarios. So I guess the point I want to make here is that the timeline that we have for adaptation depends on our success of mitigation. So it's quite hard to predict a timeline, but so from my perspective, it's important that we take a precautionary approach in our timeline thinking for adaptation. So do go and have a look at that and see what you think about how we should be planning for adaptation in our region. I'm seeing a few questions going in the chat there, so that's great. First one is from James. What are we going to be doing in the region about things apart from sea level rise? Chris, would you like to speak briefly about any plans that you know of in council for drought, fire, storms, and that kind of impact.
Yeah, thanks, Julie, and thanks, James. Look, I mean, I think sea level rise is kind of the leading example, and a threat from the perspective of a lot of that infrastructure and council services that I've talked about, as well as people's houses and wellbeing and so on. So that's sort of top of mind for me. But it's not to say that that's the only one. That's not the only threat we face. So really, what this is about for me is about addressing all risk if we can, and that includes drought and fire risk and so on, and increased storm intensity and greater increase of flooding and landslide. Those are all things that we need to be bringing into this discussion. So no, it's not at all limited to sea level rise. And in fact, to me, I think we should be also in these discussions considering things like earthquake risk, earthquake hazard, or tsunami risk. That they actually, tsunami risk in particular, it's in the same location generally as sea level rise is going to be affected by. So we should be bringing those things in as well, and doing it holistically in terms of how much risk exposure are we comfortable to live with. And I suppose that you could take that even wider. You could think about pandemic and those sorts of things, and how we how resilient, how well is our society, our communities structured for those things. So what's our risk exposure there too. So yep, absolutely. I mean, I would like to be as holistic as we possibly can with it and go as wide as we possibly can. But we need to start somewhere, and we need to take a stepwise approach and manage it carefully, I think.
Kia ora. Thanks, Chris. And a final question from Peter. From your perspective, what are the most effective ways the Climate Forum and the councils can work together to set priorities for addressing climate change?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question, and I think we're sort of feeling our way, aren't we? I mean, the climate forums got up to speed and is doing some great work, and we're looking to take as much of that on board as we can, I think, from a council perspective. So look, I think I personally really value the work that the Climate Forum members are doing, and the insights and the ideas and strategic direction that's coming from the forum. So I would encourage that to carry on happening, and we need to ensure that we as a council are able to take those things on board, listen to them, and decide whether we are able to do something about them and how we are able to respond. I know Councillor Sanson's there on this call. She might like to comment a little bit further on that as well.
Kia ora, and yeah, thanks for pointing out Rachel there. I'd like to acknowledge Rachel as well, who has just stepped up to facilitate the urban development group of the forum. She's doing that on a personal capacity rather than as a professional one. But nonetheless, Rachel, if you would like to jump in, feel free with your councillor hat on.
Well, kia ora koutou. With my councillor hat on, I feel like it's a bit of a learning curve actually, because I have been really pushing for council to consider its approach to land management in terms of forestry, and that we should be taking a much longer strategic view of civic investment in terms of things like library redevelopment, and have ended up, obviously, as many of you know, being stripped of all my portfolios and put in the naughty corner. So I'm also open to suggestions from Chris about how to best navigate these challenges effectively. But yeah, I think we just need to keep asking questions, really questioning the status quo, business as usual, and really trying to put forward the vision that we want for our community. So I think just the forum obviously isn't really lobbying council, which is important that it maintains I guess, a kind of informative and support function. But I do think that there's definitely a place for members, members in the community to keep the pressure on council with regards to where we as a community want to be heading, and maybe the speed at which we want to see climate action.
Kia ora. Thanks, Rachel. And while we're opening it up to council folk who are here today, I wonder whether Anna Geraghty or Julia would like to give their input from a TDC staffing perspective.
Oh, kia ora, Julie, thanks for that. Unfortunately, Diana's not here, who's more into the adaptation side of things, but I guess James's question before about are we considering things like drought and fire, I think as part of the Tasman Environment Plan review, those kind of things are definitely top of mind. So in future, how close can houses be built to pine forests, for instance, is one of the things they'll be considering. Also with our long-term plan, we look at things like emergency funding. So how do we try to budget for these events that keep happening sort of year on year when finances are really tight? And so that's something to consider if you're making a submission on the LTP in future. So yeah, that's the extra things I thought of. Thanks.
Kia ora. Julia, would you like to add anything? No, I don't see her.
Sorry, she's having a different conversation right now.
Oh, that's fine.
Sorry, she is here most of the time though. Yeah.
I understand. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you for those questions, and thank you to Jack and Joe and Chris for presenting that information this morning. I think it gives us a useful context for the activity that we'll jump on into now, which is looking at the Regional Strategic Climate Action Plan, or at least the first draft of part of it. Joe, are you going to explain that this morning? Awesome. Thank you. Over to you.
Oops. Okay. First, I want to acknowledge the team working on it, because they've been working really, really hard in the last few weeks to put this together for this hui. David Eyre and Olivia Hyatt, Jack Santa Barbara, and myself, and input from Tord Kjellstrom. Just a salute to those hardworking folk. And I'd like to just trace out for you the pathway that this Regional Strategic Climate Action Plan, which we call RSCAP, is proceeding on. It starts with your input, the stuff that forum members generated in the groups, and the final point we are aiming at is a brief, compressed, punchy, illustrated document which is intended to reach everyone, which is highly readable and can be understood and inspiring to lots of people, even from age 15, say mid-teens up. So the furthest other steps on this pathway, September, we sought your input on what this document should look like, and you gave it, and we incorporated that. And today we're inviting your comments on the first draft of the introduction, mitigation, and adaptation. And the big question that we hope you'll toss around today is, in the light of where we are and the risks that we're addressing, that you've just heard about, do you wish to strengthen the material in the various group chapters, which are the foundation of this document? So we'll incorporate your input on that. And in December, we hope we have the opportunity to deal more carefully with the issue of vision and values, but also particularly goal 3 of the forum, which is responding to climate change in a way that acknowledges the rights of other species and moves towards a just, equitable and resilient society for people. We also hope to incorporate something on how we get there, how what we do reaches the results that we want. Then professional writers and editors will get to work on the material, and also we are hoping infographics artists to produce the final result, which we hope will be presented to you in the February hui, ready for dissemination. So today's draft has been is the result of the work of the various groups, but has also been through the Science, Tech and Research group, and had input from the CAP group, the Climate Action Plan group. Things to note about this draft is that there is some emphasis on regional measurement of emissions and emphasis on the annual reductions that I spoke of a few minutes ago. This is to stress the fact that we need to be acting on this here in this region and now, both mitigation and adaptation, and not just before 2030, not just before 2050, today. And we need to be reducing by 100 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent a year. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, those calculations may change when we get the input from the Climate Change Commission, but they probably won't be less shocking than the estimates that I've just given. So today, please consider two things. One is, do you want to strengthen your group chapter to which readers may refer by hyperlink and from which we draw for the document? And have we left anything out or got anything wrong that's major and important that you need to tell us about? We're not looking for copy editing of our writing style because we do intend to engage professional writers in this. So it'd be good if you designate one person in each group to enter any suggestions on the any suggestions that you want to write into the document. Please write in suggestions in the right-hand column rather than editing on the document. And this bit should be done by the end of this Sunday, after which we'll get to work on incorporating it. And we want to thank you for many suggestions that you've already made on the document. Now, if you intend to get your group together to strengthen your group document, that content we're happy to accept over the next month or so. It would be helpful to let us know that it's coming. That will help our work program. So just to repeat that, two opportunities for feedback. If there's stuff that you want to make suggestions on in the document as it's presented to you, do that. Particularly, it's helpful to designate one person to do it by the end of this Sunday. If you're getting your group together, we'll accept suggestions over the next month on a revised group document. So any questions about the tasks of the breakout group? And also, Julie, I need to just align with you and make sure that I have said what you intended, or if you want to modify anything that I've said there.
No, that sounds wonderful, thank you. So the main question for each breakout room is, are the relevant actions to your topic that you see in that document sufficient, do you think, to the scale of the problem that we've just been looking at? If not, then what's missing? What needs to change? I've put the link to the document in the chat. And if you very quickly work your way through that question and you'd like a little more to think about, then the next question might be, given the various timelines, what might we prioritize? And also, given our vision and our values for the region that we're working from, what should we prioritize? So there's some really interesting questions there. Okay, so let's crack on to the breakout rooms. What I'm just going to try this. I don't know if it's going to work, so bear with me. I'm going to open the rooms and you should be able to choose which room you want to be part of. So first of all, I'm going to ask the facilitators, so that's David, Olivia, and Jack and Joe. Jack and Joe, have you arranged an extra computer or did that not work out?
We tried really hard and
that's fine, thank you. So you guys will decide which one together you would like to be part of, and Jesse's going to facilitate one of them as well. And we'll need someone else to put up their hand to facilitate the remaining discussion. And that facilitation, of course, just means making sure everybody who wants to gets a chance to speak and that the conversation stays on track. So I'll ask those people to put themselves into the relevant group first, and make sure that's all working out. And once we've got a facilitator in each room, I'll invite you all to choose your room. If we've got 34 people and 5 groups, so we should have maybe between 5 and 10 people per group. If you find yourself in a group that's got more than 10 people, can I invite you, if you don't mind which group you're in, to leave that one and join another one by rejoining the main room, and then you'll be able to be put into a different group of your choice. Okay, so let's see how that works. I'm going to open all rooms now. Okay, so can the facilitators, Olivia, David, Jesse, and Jack and Joe, choose which one you want to be in?
Which one are you going to choose? Okay, you will need to facilitate it because
Hopefully that will work all right.
Julie, it says I have to wait to be assigned.
Oh no. Duh. That's not what I asked it to do. Okay, I guess what we'll do then is I'll just put people in and you'll end up where you end up. Sorry, folks. Unless you want to spend the time to go through and choose. I suppose we could do that. Okay. So Olivia, I'm putting you in physical adaptation. Yeah. Jessie, I'm putting you in sequestration.